Welcome to the debate. Today we are taking a sledgehammer to, probably the most fragile and heavily protected artifact in human history, our ego.
Yeah, and it could definitely use a good smash every now and then.
Exactly. Specifically, we are dismantling this desperate, clawing need to answer the question, why are we here? I mean, for thousands of years, we have built cathedrals, written scriptures, waged wars, all just to answer that single question. We desperately want to be the protagonists of some divine drama. But the source material we are discussing today, which is The Meaning of Our Lives and Existence by Park Monkey, calls this entire pursuit a fundamental error in reasoning.
A massive error, according to him.
We are just the unintended byproducts of a 36.7 billion year cosmic churn. So the central thesis is stark, and frankly, it's terrifying to some people. He says that finding a fundamental reason for your birth is the fastest path to misery. True salvation, if you want to call it that, lies in accepting that you are here by sheer dumb luck.
And that is exactly where I have to dig my heels in. Because while this text presents itself as this manifesto of cool, scientific nihilism, telling us to relax because there is no script, I really believe it fails to hold its own weight. It is a bait and switch.
A bait and switch? How so?
Well, upon a closer, more forensic reading, the author does not actually remove meaning from human life. He simply forcefully evicts God and philosophy only to immediately move in a new, even stricter tenet. And that tenet is the genome. He argues we are accidental, yes, but then in the very next breath, he burdens us with this crushing, almost fanatical obligation that he calls biological permanence.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot tell an audience that they are meaningless dust in the wind and then demand they secure the survival of the species for the next 36 billion years. That is not a release from purpose. That is a secular religion with very strict commandments. I firmly oppose the idea that he successfully proves finding a fundamental reason for existence is meaningless. He just gave us a new reason.
I think you are mistaking purpose for function. Look at a hammer, right? A hammer doesn't have a soul, but it has a job. Let's establish the baseline reality the author actually asks us to confront here. He starts with the timeline, 36.7 billion years. That is the scale of the universe's history relative to our potential future. Now, for the vast majority of that time, we did not exist. He calls this the void, or hell.
Right, but not in the fiery demon sense.
No, not fire and brimstone, in the sense of absolute non-existence. Then you get a flicker, maybe 80 years if you eat your vegetables. Then right back to the void. To look at that microscopic flicker and ask what is the grand metaphysical design of this is pure narcissism. We are thrown into the world. You didn't fill out an application form to be born.
Sure.
You didn't choose to appear in this century in this specific body. It happened to you. Therefore, the search for a big capital W-Y is an attempt to write a script for a movie that was never actually filmed.
But the script is being written, and the author is the one holding the pen. He explicitly states that while the start is an accident, the continuation is a duty. But actually, before we get to that contradiction, we have to talk about his view of the human mind, because this is the foundation of his meaninglessness argument, and honestly, it is one of the most provocative parts of the book. I'm talking about the sea squirt metaphor.
Oh, it is a brilliant, totally humbling metaphor. Let's look at the sea squirt. In its larval stage, this tiny creature has a rudimentary brain and a spinal cord. Why? Because it needs to swim. It has to navigate the ocean current to find a suitable rock to latch onto. But here is the kicker. Once the sea squirt finds that rock and attaches itself, it becomes stationary. It no longer needs to move. So what does it do?
It digests its own brain.
Exactly. It eats its own spinal cord for energy.
Because the mind is no longer useful for survival.
Yes, and the author uses this to strike a massive blow against human intellectual vanity. Evolutionary biologists argue the brain is not a tool for finding truth with a capital T. It isn't an antenna for God. It is a motor function. It's a tool for movement, for finding food, avoiding predators, navigating three-dimensional space. We developed the survival engine, and now, just because we have free time, we are using it to contemplate the metaphysics of the cosmos.
Right, but
The text is basically telling us you are using a hammer to solve a crossword puzzle. When we use a survival tool to ask, why am I here, we are misusing the equipment. That is why the answer is always silence. That is why the answer feels so empty. The text says we must shift the question from why do I exist, which is completely unanswerable, to how do I live happily. That shift is the only way to escape the void.
Look, I am not convinced by that line of reasoning at all, because it reduces the human experience to pure mechanics. And the text itself doesn't even stick to it. If the brain is just a motor function and we are just sophisticated sea squirts trying to stick to a rock, then why does the author introduce concepts like dignity, sin, and heaven? You don't see sea squirts debating dignity.
Well,
He defines sin specifically as exploiting others or hindering their survival. He defines heaven not as a place you go to after you die, but as a state of living in harmony right now. If we are purely biological accidents, where does this strict moral structure come from? The author claims there is no script, but then he hands us a rulebook.
I wouldn't call it a...
He says, don't let others dictate your life, but then dictates that we must reject religious ideologies that exploit labor. He is replacing a theological meaning with a biological and ethical one. He is absolutely smuggling meaning back in through the back door.
I see why it looks like smuggling, but I view it as an operating manual. The text isn't saying there are no rules for operation. It's saying there is no external reason the machine exists. The rules you mentioned, avoiding sin, seeking harmony, those are functional requirements for that happiness the author prioritizes. Let's look at the core debate here, chance versus the mandate of survival. The text reiterates that we are distinct dots on this massive timeline. We are lucky to be here.
Lucky, sure.
The author emphasizes that since we will inevitably die and return to non-existence, the only heaven we will ever have is right here, right now. The duty isn't a divine command. It's a strategy for maximizing this brief heaven. If you destroy the ecosystem, you destroy your own heaven. That is not morality. That is basic cause and effect.
But is it just cause and effect? Let's look at the actual words he uses. The text uses the term biological permanence. It says, and I quote, "Our life's goal is ensuring biological permanence." That is a capital G goal. The author argues that even if we die, we must ensure our descendants can enjoy this heaven for the next 36.7 billion years. He even goes so far as to say that if you cannot have children, you should allow your spouse to have them with someone else to ensure this continuity.
Which is a deeply pragmatic biological view.
It is a profound, almost fanatical devotion to a cause greater than oneself. If I am just a random accident, why should I care if the chain continues after I dissolve into the void? Why should I care about the next 36 billion years if I won't be there to see it? The text is demanding that I find meaning in being a link in an eternal chain. That is a massive why. It answers the question, why are we here, with to ensure we stay here. He is failing his own premise.
He answers it with a biological imperative, not a spiritual one. He calls this evolutionary stability. If we don't respect diversity and biological permanence, we go extinct. I would argue that this isn't a meaning imposed by the universe, but a drive encoded in our very cells. The text is very clear on this. Walking on water is not a miracle. Biological permanence is the miracle. He's grounding our awe in the physical reality of endurance.
Yeah, by stripping away the mysticism.
Exactly. You call it a fanatical devotion, but the text frames it as fidelity to reality. If we don't prioritize biological permanence, the accident of humanity ends. And while the universe might not care, the author argues that we must care because we are the stakeholders.
But that is the nihilistic trap he tries to dance around. If the universe is truly random and billions of years of void awaits us, human extinction shouldn't matter. But the author cares deeply. He cares about cultural persistence too. He says it is our duty to develop cultural heritage. He even defines enemies as those who destroy culture or biological viability. This is a crusade. He has replaced God with the genome and the culture. He's preaching a religion of survival to refute the idea that life has meaning, while simultaneously building a cathedral to the glory of human DNA.
I would frame that entirely differently. I would argue he is preaching a philosophy of immanence, valuing what is here, because it is literally all we have. And this actually brings us to the nature of suffering, which is a huge part of the text, and perhaps its most controversial statistical claim. The author states that life is 70% suffering, 20% peace, and only 10% joy.
Yeah, it's a bleak actuarial table for the human experience. It sounds like a review of a very bad hotel.
Perhaps, but he argues it is a highly realistic assessment of our biology. The text explains that pleasure is fleeting by design. It inevitably turns into pain. The classic example is hunger. Hunger is pain, eating is pleasure. But once you are full, if you keep eating, it becomes pain again. Or the pleasure of a new purchase. It fades, leading to the pain of wanting more. The text says, one of the important characteristics of pleasure is that once pleasure is obtained, it is no longer pleasure.
The treadmill.
Right. Because of this cycle, this samsara of suffering and pleasure, searching for a grand, happy design behind it all just leads to despair. If you think life is supposed to be happy, you will be miserable. If you accept it is mostly suffering, you can actually find peace.
And this is where I find the author's logic the most strained, and honestly, almost manipulative. He admits life is 70% suffering, yet he insists we must realize that only this place that exists is heaven. That is a massive, glaring contradiction. If I am in pain 70% of the time, and you tell me, welcome to heaven, I would say you are gaslighting me.
It isn't gaslighting, it's a recalibration of...
To call this existence heaven requires a leap of faith just as large as believing in a pearly gate. It is a psychological trick. He is trying to redefine heaven as simply not being dead.
It is a redefinition of the baseline. The text argues that the alternative, non-existence, is the void. Compared to the void, even the struggle of existence has value because it simply is. The author suggests a spell or a mantra to endure the pain. He says life requires both suffering and pleasure. We must find our own balance. He is offering a coping mechanism, yes, but one based on acceptance rather than escapism. He criticizes religions that promise a next world because they devalue this one. If you think the real party is after you die, you will treat this life as a waiting room. The text wants us to treat the waiting room as the destination, peeling wallpaper and all.
I agree that he wants us to value the present. But look at how he handles the concept of hell. He says hell is not a separate place. He says, if I fight with my family and coworkers, that is hell. This implies that heaven and hell are states of mind and relationship. But then he explicitly advises us to chant a spell to get through the pain. This admits that the meaninglessness of life is unbearable without some form of ritual or self-hypnosis. The text proves that humans cannot live without creating meaning. If the universe doesn't give us one, we have to invent spells to survive the 70% suffering. We aren't sea squirts. We are meaning-making machines. The text fails to refute the need for a fundamental reason. It just provides a DIY kit for creating your own.
That is a fair point. We are certainly wired for it, but let's look at the ethical dimension. The text moves from the internal struggle to how we treat others. This is where the distinction between the positive and negative golden rule comes in. This is a crucial distinction in the source material, and it really speaks to how we should govern ourselves in a meaningless world.
It is definitely one of the more politically charged sections of the text.
The author strongly champions the negative golden rule. Never do to others what you would not like others to do to you. He explicitly rejects the positive version, do to others as you would have them do to you. His reasoning is that the positive rule actually leads to violence. It leads to people forcing their version of good on others, ideologies, religions, even capitalism. When we think we know what is best for someone else, we become tyrants. In a meaningless universe, we are liberated from the tyranny of forced goodness. We just need to not hurt each other. That is his definition of avoiding hell.
That sounds very libertarian and tolerant on the surface. Live and let live. But the text doesn't actually stick to that non-interference policy. The author critiques religion heavily, saying gods don't talk, and that religions exist to exploit your pocket money and free labor. He is very active in telling us what not to believe. Furthermore, he defines sin. He says sin is exploiting and forcing sacrifices on others. But then he brings in the concept of the snow leopard from the Book of Rights to explain nature.
The snow leopard is a key example of his view on the amorality of nature. A snow leopard kills a sheep. To the human owner of the sheep, the leopard is evil. To the leopard, it is just lunch. The text says there is no such thing as good or evil in nature. The Tibetan monk pats the leopard and understands its innocence. The author champions this view. We must stop viewing the world through a human-centric lens of good versus evil. We are just parts of a complex food chain. We are not judges. We are participants.
But here is the paradox, and it is a big one. He wants us to be like the snow leopard, beyond good and evil, but he also insists on human dignity. The text states, human beings are dignified beings. However, human dignity is premised on certain conditions. And what is that condition? First, you have to solve the problem of making a living yourself. This is where the text reveals a very specific, almost capitalist work ethic hidden inside its spiritual nihilism. A stone is equal to a human in the cosmic sense, but a human is only dignified if they are economically self-sufficient. If I am a biological accident, why is my dignity tied to my ability to earn money? The snow leopard doesn't have a job, it just takes.
The snow leopard earns its living by hunting. If it fails, it dies. The text is emphasizing independence to avoid parasitism. The author rails against parasitism. He says, the end of a selfish life is only doubt about life. He praises symbiosis and coexistence. He argues that dignity comes from not being a burden on others. This links right back to the negative golden rule. If you are self-sufficient, you aren't exploiting others. It is a consistent internal logic. Existence is an accident, but survival requires effort. If you don't make that effort, you fall into parasitism, which is a violation of the ecosystem's balance.
Violation of the ecosystem. See? You are using moral language again. Parasitism in nature just is. Tapeworms exist, they aren't wrong. But the author judges them. He says we must find and walk our own path and take responsibility. These are moral commands. My argument stands here. The text fails to prove that seeking a fundamental reason for life is meaningless. It simply swaps out a divine judge for an ecological judge. It says God won't punish you, but the laws of evolutionary stability will. It is the exact same structure, just different terminology. It is a theology of the self-made survivor.
I see it differently. I see it as a shift from authority to consequence. God is an authority. Evolutionary stability is a consequence. The text warns us about the consequences of our actions. If we exploit, if we fight, we create hell right now. If we cooperate, we create heaven. It is purely pragmatic. The author even addresses death with this pragmatic view. When we exist, death has not yet come, and when death comes, we no longer exist. Therefore, worry is useless. The focus is entirely on the quality of the now.
And yet, he can't help but peek at the future. He predicts that in 50 years we will recognize animals as equals. In 200 years, we will recognize a stone as equal to a human. He has a teleology, a belief that history is moving toward a higher state of spiritual awareness or enlightenment. That is a narrative of progress. A truly random, meaningless universe doesn't progress toward enlightenment, it just churns. The author wants it both ways. He wants the cool detachment of nihilism, but the warm fuzzies of spiritual evolution. He wants to say nothing matters, but also everything is getting better.
I would frame that as expanding awareness rather than spiritual destiny. As we understand biology better, we realize we are made of the same stardust as the stone. That is scientific fact, not religious prophecy. It is the removal of the ego, layer by layer. But let's look at the author's ultimate conclusion on heaven. He claims that realizing that only this place that exists is heaven is the beginning of true enlightenment.
But does he even believe it? He talks about the 36.7 billion years of heaven before we were born. He calls the void heaven because there was no pain. Then he calls life heaven because we exist. He calls the future void heaven again. If everything is heaven, then nothing is heaven. It renders the word completely meaningless. It seems he is terrified of the word hell or oblivion, so he just paints the word heaven over everything to soothe the reader. The title even says it, a book that soothes the mind like a spell. He admits he is casting a spell on us. He is trying to hypnotize us into believing that the void is a warm blanket.
Or perhaps he is breaking the spell of fear. If the void is peaceful because there is no pain and life is vibrant because of existence, then there is nothing to fear in any direction. That is the ultimate relief. The text offers a profound relief from pressure. We don't need to be saints. We don't need to be heroes. We don't need to be remembered for 1,000 years. We just need to survive, find our balance between the 70% pain and 10% joy, and perhaps leave a biological or cultural legacy. The reason is that there is no reason, and that is freedom.
And I maintain that humans cannot live on that diet. The text proves it by immediately supplementing the no-reason diet with the heavy vitamins of duty, legacy, and dignity. The text absolutely fails to prove meaninglessness. Instead, it proves that humans cannot live without creating meaning, even if that meaning is framed as evolutionary stability. We are wired to find the fundamental why, even if the answer is just to continue. The author is a meaning maker in denial. He hasn't refuted the search for a fundamental reason, he has just provided a new one, to maintain the chain.
Which brings us to our final reflection. Whether you accept the author's premise that we are C²2 should just enjoy the rock we stuck to, or you agree with the perspective that we are inescapably moral creatures building a legacy, the text forces a confrontation with the now.
It really does. It demands we treat the present moment with intense urgency. The author says, "I speak with the urgency of knowing I could die tomorrow." On that we can definitely agree. Whether this is a random accident or a sacred duty, the time we have is finite. The text, despite its contradictions, effectively shakes the reader by the shoulders and says, "Wake up."
Exactly. The source material asks us to stop looking at the sky for answers and look at the person or the cat or the stone right next to us, to treat this exact moment as the only heaven we will ever get.
A terrifying thought, considering the 70% suffering statistic, but a motivating one. It challenges us to beat the odds.
Indeed. We leave you, the listener, to decide, are you a biological accident finding freedom in the void, or are you a link in an eternal chain burdened with the glorious duty of permanence?
Or perhaps, like the sea squirt, you are just trying to figure out where to settle before the current takes you.
Thank you for joining us on The